It's not always as easy to find evidence for historical arguments you want to make in the archives, especially if it's a subject that hasn't been extensively researched before. I remember the first time I went to the National Archives in Kew, where there is huge amounts of records of all sorts of things for hundreds of years. And I told them what I was looking for, and I was told I wouldn't find anything there. Undeterred, I went to the internet search engine Discovery at the National Archives, and I started typing in search terms. It's hard to find Africans in the archives, partly because archives tend to be organised by year or somebody's surname, but not necessarily by ethnicity. I tried lots of terms for Africans, starting with modern ones, but also using older terms that were used in the 16th century, such as blackamoor, Moor, Ethiop, although somebody who was an Ethiopian wasn't necessarily from modern day Ethiopia, and then the word Negro, which was used quite commonly in the period, even though we don't use it now. And when I typed in Negro, there were only 2 results in this search engine of hundreds and thousands of documents. And one of them related to something that had happened in a different country, but the other one was the testimony in a Star Chamber court case in 1597 of a man who was described as Edward Swarthy, alias Negro. And that opened up this amazing story of an African who had come to Britain from the Caribbean with Francis Drake and had become a porter in a country house in Gloucestershire, and then, quite remarkably, had ended up whipping a white fellow servant called John Guy, who went on to become one of the first colonial governors of Newfoundland and an MP and the mayor of Bristol. Somehow, his testimony had become catalogued separately from all the other records in the court case, which normally would have only been filed under Buck versus Winter, which was the name of his employer and the man he was being sued by. So it was just really incredibly good luck that that document turned up in the search engine. So it's not always easy to find the evidence, but there is a lot of evidence, and I found over sort of 400 references to Africans in Tudor documents. So I'm going to tell you a bit about some of those sources and what we can learn from them. So a lot of the detail we have of how many Africans were in England and where they were living come from parish registers. Now, these were records kept by churches listing baptisms, marriages, and burials, and they're quite extensive. They only began to be kept for the first time in the Tudor period, something we can thank Thomas Cromwell for. He was one of Henry VIII's ministers, but even though it became mandatory to do this after the Reformation, in fact, a lot of the records we have only start at the beginning of Elizabeth I's reign. And through those, we can find out quite a lot of detail about people. We can find out their names. We can often find out their ages. We can learn when they were baptized, when they died and were buried, who they married. Sometimes they can be quite sparse. So it could just say something like John, a blackamoor, was buried. So you sometimes don't even have a surname to go on. But in other cases, you can get occupations. So if someone was a servant, it'll say who they were working for. And that can sometimes you can marry up, you can find the baptism record and the marriage record and the burial record for someone, and then you have a kind of whole lifespan there. And we can find Africans who lived. There was an African in Hackney who lived to the age, his name was Anthony, and he lived to the age of 105, apparently, according to his burial record. And there's some really interesting cases where an African is baptized only a few weeks or a month before they're married, which shows that they, like quite a few Africans, have adult baptisms because they weren't born here, although there are also quite a few records of people who were born to one African and one English parent in this country. So these records are useful for that, and they're useful for the geographical spread. So we find Africans in parish registers across the country, in small rural villages, and sort of in larger concentrations in port cities like Plymouth, Southampton, Bristol, and of course London. But they don't give us a lot of biographical information, a lot of detail about people's lives, what was going on in their lives. Another source of information are household accounts. So these are financial accounts that were kept by the royal household and by aristocratic households, recording. These were recording payment of wages, of rewards, payments for clothing or shoes bought for household servants, and any other kind of household expenses. And that's where we find records of Africans being paid wages, like John Blank, the royal trumpeter, but also somebody like James the Blackamoor, who was a cook in Tavistock in Devon for the Earl of Dorset in the 1640s. And so those are useful in that, again, they give us some information about names, places, and times that people were living here, and their kind of employment status, and in some cases sort of how they got here as well. And so that can add to the picture from parish registers, as can tax returns. So there was an alien poll tax, which meant strangers had to pay a specific tax. And so there are also records of Africans paying this poll tax in mostly the ones I found were in Southampton, and there's one in Hull and Portsmouth. But I think by far the sort of juiciest evidence comes from legal records, because when people go to court, there's usually a story there. And what I found was, like Edward Swarthy, there were several Africans who were witnesses in court cases in this period, including Jacques Francis, the salvage diver, who, as far as we know, is the first African we know of who gave evidence in an English court of law in the 1548, and Edward Swarthy, and several other examples. And that gives us, and these court cases can give us much more detailed information about what was going on in somebody's life. It usually is a snapshot in time, so we have a particular story or event, but they can be really rich sources as well. And one of the claims that I make in my work that I think is really important is that Africans were not enslaved in Tudor and early Stuart England. This is particularly important when we look at the broader story of Black British history and Britain's role in the Atlantic world. For much of the intervening period between us and the Tudor period, Africans were enslaved, exploited, and transported away from their homes by British slavers, and then exploited for their labour in Caribbean plantations, and of course before the American War of Independence in American colonies as well. And that was a legacy that continued into the problems we see with racism across the world, and specifically in former British colonies and in Britain itself today. A lot of discussions of racism and enslavement historically claim that racism was endemic and inevitable and always present in the European mindset. But what if that wasn't true? What can we learn from the experience of Africans in Tudor England to answer that question, to ask whether it really was inevitable and ever present? And if Africans were not enslaved in Tudor England, then what historical processes and events led to the beginning of British people enslaving African people? Because if we can understand the origins of enslavement and racism, then I think that puts us in a stronger position to combat the legacies of enslavement and racism in our societies today. It's fairly simple to prove that there were no statute laws issued in Britain actually throughout our history making enslavement legal. Other countries did issue what are known as slave codes, delineating this practice and making it clear that Black people were enslaved people, and that was a hereditary status. But that never happened in the British Parliament, although it did happen in most English colonies. So beyond statute law, there's also case law. So when court cases happen in English courts and judgments are reached, but those aren't absolute, and each judge can then make their own judgments, but sometimes basing it on previous judgments. But in terms of the Tudor and early Stuart period, there's only one court case that considers enslavement, which is the Cartwright case of 1569, where it was ruled that the air of England is too pure an air for slaves to breathe in. So it wasn't legal to enslave people in Tudor England, but were Africans enslaved in practice in Tudor England, despite the fact it wasn't legal? I mean, we know today that people are enslaved in England despite the fact it's illegal. So one really interesting piece of evidence we can use to help answer this question of whether Africans were enslaved in England in this period is the probate inventory of Cattelena of Almondsbury. Now, Cattelena died in 1625, and she didn't leave a will, but because she owned a certain amount of property valued in total as more than £5, the rule was that they then had to make a probate inventory, or a list of all the goods that she owned at the time of her death. So your teacher should have a copy of Cattelina's inventory, and why don't you take a look at that now and have a think about what it can tell us about whether she and other Africans were enslaved. So you've had a little look at the inventory now. I think one of the parts of the inventory to look more closely at is the description of Cattelena at the beginning, where it says she's a single woman. And in a way, it's almost, what does that tell us, but what does it not tell us? Is there, if she was enslaved by somebody, how might that be reflected in that initial description of her and her status? Think about not so much the details of what she owned, but the fact that she owned things at all. What does that tell us? What does the fact that a list of her goods was being made at the time of her death? Also, when you're looking at the list, have a think, what's not on this list? What would you expect someone to need for their lives that just isn't on here? And what can that tell us about Cattelena's life? So I hope you've come up with lots of arguments and supporting evidence using this really interesting document. I'm now going to tell you what I made of it. I think at this point it's good to note that, unfortunately, this one piece of paper is the only evidence we have so far for Cattelena's life, and if only she'd written a diary or a series of letters, it would be wonderful to hear about her life in her own words. And this is a limitation that's really frustrating when we're looking at the lives of Africans in this period. You know, a lot of pieces of evidence like this are written by white men, and we have to try and read against the grain a little to think about things from Cattelena's perspective. So looking at this list, I think that one of the overarchingly important piece of evidence that this gives us in terms of the question of were Africans enslaved is that enslaved people were property in the eyes of the law. They didn't own property. But here we have Cattelena owning several different items and that being recognised in a legal document. So the most valuable thing that Cattelena owned was her cow, worth about £3. It was such a useful thing to own that in the years before, many years before benefits were brought in by the authorities, some parishes actually gave poor people a cow rather than cash or other goods in order to give them something sustainable to help them survive. Because not only could you get milk from your cow, you could then use that milk to make butter and cheese and cream, which were all great in giving you protein and other nutrients needed to sustain life. But also, if you made enough of them, you might actually be able to sell those products to your neighbours. So in the book, I imagine Cattelena spending quite a lot of time on the village green in Almondsbury, just outside the church, and there's some pretty views of that if you look in the book. So I imagine her spending time on the village green with her cow and milking her cow, which I think is interesting when we're trying to imagine what her daily life would be like. I don't think there was a lot of luxury items on this list, but I think that perhaps the tablecloth, you don't really need a tablecloth, do you? But it's nice to have one. And the candlestick being made out of pewter meant that it was more valuable than one made out of, say, wood. But it's not a silver candlestick, so I think that tells us a little. actually, since writing the book, somebody mentioned to me, I think in the book I kind of query why she only had one sheet, whereas in order to make a bed you kind of need two sheets. And it turns out that apparently people used one of their sheets to wind, they were called winding sheets. So they actually wrapped the body up in a sheet before it was buried. So perhaps that's the answer to the mystery of Catalena's missing sheet. I asked you earlier what was missing from the list, and you'll find that there isn't really any furniture on the list. There's not a table, there isn't a bed as such, and so the conclusion I drew from that was that perhaps she shared her house, because as a single woman, she might not have had a large income, and it was fairly common for single women to cohabit. So one of the other things we can see from this document is that the administrator of Catalena's estate, which is another name for her property, was a woman called Helen Ford. And the administrator of your property was often somebody you were most intimate with, most close to. And so I hypothesized that Helen Ford might have been Catalena's housemate, so to speak. So again, when we look at how Cattelena is described in this document, she's described simply as a single woman, which to me suggests that she must have been independent and not anybody's servant, and certainly not anybody's property. Because if she was enslaved or a servant in a household, it would be quite normal for that to be listed in a document like this. So in my work and in my book, I very much drew this conclusion that Africans weren't enslaved in Tudor England. But that's not the end of the story. And the joy of history is that each scholar brings to the evidence their own perspectives and experience. And what's really exciting now is that a new generation of young students and researchers are looking at this evidence and finding other evidence and asking these big questions some more, and asking other questions as well. And I think one of the questions that I didn't focus on so much in my work was whether Tudor England was a racist society. And that's definitely something I get asked a lot in talks and by the public, especially since the murder of George Floyd. And I think that's a really important question that needs more research. And I think some of the evidence that I've found is indicative in certain ways. We can see that the way that Africans are treated by the church and by the legal authorities show that they were not sort of discriminated against in such a way that we might think of as constituting institutional racism. But there's still a lot to learn and to think about in terms of interpersonal racism and how people were really treated and what their lived experience was day to day. And one of the fruitful and exciting areas on this is where historians are working together with literature scholars who look at things like the plays of Shakespeare, characters like Othello or Aaron in Titus Andronicus, but also more kind of casual and passing references to Africans in literature, which can tell us more about people's ideas and what was going on inside people's heads than some of these drier legal or institutional documents. And so I hope you've enjoyed thinking about some of this evidence, and I hope you'll keep asking questions.